I am not a specialist of sickle cell disease. Also, I see some patients and I do research on these topics, but it is very interesting to see it start from a single mutation in the beta globin genes, and we do see it's massive consequences on the general body. So first, we do see with this mutation anemia, which is very important, and as Wassim said, there is two kinds of mechanisms to explain this anemia. First, it's the lack of production, but also the increase of destruction of red cells from a single mutation. And then also, we know it is a systemic disease, and you see this patient experience a lot of symptoms, including pain and acute complications like acute chest syndrome, for example, and acute pain with venous occlusive crisis in this patient, but also they experience some chronic complication. And I do see patients with sickle cell disease as some kind of early aging, and you have some brain function defect with cognitive dysfunction, and you have heart defect, and you have liver defect. And so when you see these patients, they died early, and they exhibit some feature of early aging patient. So, you know, it's not very simple. And also, it's the most frequent genetic disease. And we know when we look on the point of view of epidemiology of sickle cell disease, we do see, depending, as you said before, on the region of the patient where they are, they have different phenotype. Although there's the same single mutation in the beta globin gene. So to explain these differences, I think we should focus and work on two factors which are very important. And there's a lot of work of the genetic background of this patient. And the first one, as Wassim said, is the increase of fetal hemoglobin, because it do prevent the polymerization, which is well known. But we know also there's a lot of different genetic background which may change the phenotype of the disease, and I will explain later on, because we know this disease play a role in interaction between red cells and immune cells in the body. So at this level, there's a lot of polymorphism which may explain the different phenotype of the patient, which is very important. And second, also, there's the environment of the patient, because we know now a lot of data on the microbiota, for example, or what you do eat might be very important also to explain the change in phenotype of this patient. And I strongly believe that we will improve take care of the patient based on good, strong science. And I think it's very important. I think sickle cell disease is a very good example of that. First, as we said, erythropoiesis in sickle cell disease is impaired, and with defective or ineffective erythropoiesis, it depends where you do see. And something is very important that we have shown for the last 20 years is that red cells, when you look at these cells, when they do differentiate, they exhibit features of apoptosis, you know, the condensation of the nucleus, the condensation of the chromatin, and the exclusion of the nuclei, and also the mitochondria, which is very important, give rise to cells which are no nuclei, no more transcription, no more anything. So here, by doing a very good science, we have shown that this process is some kind of control cell death. What is very important to control the cell death, because we have to change the rate of production depending on what we do need in the periphery, and EPO is critical for that. And we have shown that, which is very peculiar, that the cells are dying through the caspase activation. But also this caspase activation is critical for the differentiation. And the way we regulate our production of red cells depends on the capacity to cleave some target in the cells. In one way, we'll differentiate. In one way, we'll induce apoptosis. And as Wassim said, we have a heat shock protein which go to the nucleus to protect GATA1 during the differentiation. But as soon as this protein go outside the nucleus, the cell will die because caspase will cleave GATA1. So very rapidly, we can adjust the production of red cells. And obviously, in thalassemia, what we do see is the excess of alpha chains. We sequestrate the HSP17 in the nucleus, so the cell will die by apoptosis because you cleave GATA1. But in addition to that, they do produce, you know, like the classical hemichromes, which induce reactive oxygen species, which are very important as a regulator of hemoglobin formation, polymerization, and so on. But what we have shown is that these ROS induce the production of the TGF-beta member family. And one of them And to respond to your question, it's very confusing when you see and you read papers, because people claim that TGF-beta 1 is a massive inducer of anemia. When you inject TGF-beta in rabbits, on rat, you see a decrease of hemoglobin level very rapidly. But when you look carefully what TGF-beta is doing, TGF-beta 1, what he's doing, in fact, as him said, when you start from the BFUE through the red cells, you have at least, if you hypothesize that every time you differentiate, you make a division. From one red cells to go to the end, you need 2 to the 8, you produce 2 to the 8 cells from one cell, which is massive. But no, what's doing TGF-beta 1? In fact, it's a massive accelerator of the differentiation of erythropoietic cells. In fact, you differentiate in 2 or 3 divisions from the BFUA to the orthochromatic red cells. So you will produce only 2 to the 3rd, meaning 8 cells when you compare to 2 to the 8, which is a massive reduction of the way you produce red cells. So TGF-beta is an engager for the differentiation, and also it blocks the production because it accelerates the differentiation. But now what is confusing with luspatercept is that luspatercept do not block TGF-beta. It blocks the TGF-beta member family, including one which is called GDF11 and BMP6 and GDF8. And it's very important because we know that hemichromes and ROS induce the production of GDF11. And GDF11 block the end stage of erythroid differentiation from polychromatophilic to orthochromatic red cells. It's a blockade at this level, which explains why we block the differentiation when we have too much GDF11 due to the ROS production. And in addition, and we have shown that in the blood island, you see the contact between mature red cells and early red cells induce the interaction of these cells, and they do express Fas ligand and Fas. So this one induces the caspase activation for the differentiation. And when you have GDF11, what you will do, you decrease the expression of this DES receptor, meaning that the cells will grow. And we see in ineffective erythropoiesis in thalassemia, you have the red cells go from the bone marrow and they go outside the bone marrow, which is totally abnormal because you lose this kind of inhibition by the contact with the caspase activation. And if you block GDF11, so you will increase Fas ligand and you reduce this massive proliferation of red cells. So you block the ineffective erythropoiesis. And in addition, you stop the blockade of GDF11 at the time of differentiation. So it's quite complicated, it's a different mechanism of action to explain how luspatercept is working in thalassemia. So to come back to sickle cell disease, we know also, which is very important now, during the defective erythropoiesis or ineffective erythropoiesis, will lead to the production of red cells. And these red cells might be normal or abnormal. And we know that during ineffective erythropoiesis, you produce cells which are lower in ATP content, which present mitochondria, for example, in sickle cell, which leads to inflammation, and we increase ROS, and this ROS may precipitate also the cycling of beta S hemoglobin. So if you correct ineffective erythropoiesis, you have 2 consequences. First, you will increase anemia, or you will decrease anemia, and you will produce red cells with a very good shape, which do not sickle as much as a classical sickle cell disease. And this concept has been demonstrated, with metapivat drugs. When you stimulate the pyruvate kinase, what you do, you improve erythropoiesis in sickle cell disease by increasing ATP. You reduce the 2,3-DPG concentration, which allow a better oxygenation of the globin, and then you have a better red cells which do not sickle in the periphery, which is very important now to work in this understanding of increasing ineffective erythropoiesis to have a better red cell in a better good shape. And also, we have make some work currently, which is very important, that the red cells and the erythroblasts in the bone marrow find some signaling pathway that we don't know yet to the macrophages to regulate the erythrophagocytosis. And it's very important also that we know that this abnormal erythropoiesis may also determine the half-life of the red cells. So by playing also in effective erythropoiesis, you may increase the red lifespan and with a better red cell. So we have to focus now to understand the role of erythropoiesis. And then we know in the future we have to understand the interaction between red cells and the periphery. Because in the classical view, in sickle cell disease, we do think that sickle cells are going to sickle in the small vessels and induce some ischemia and some kind of infarctus. But when you look really at the lesion of what is going in the small tissues, you have no infarction. It's not like a classical thrombosis and infarction. And what we do know is probably red cells, when they get localized, they will interact with the immune innate system, which is very important actor and component of the physiopathology of sickle cell disease. And we have shown, and Slimane has shown in the laboratory very recently, that we try to explain and to understand why sickle and in sickle cell you have such inflammation when you release hemoglobin. And you can see in all of textbooks that it's due to heme release by the cells. But when you look at other kind of anemia, like Minkowski-Schoffer or spherocytic hemolytic anemia, you have a lot of heme which is released because you have a chronic hemolysis. When you look at thalassemia, because ineffective erythropoiesis, you have a lot of heme, but you have no inflammation that we do see in sickle cell disease. So we looked at the mutation because we know the single mutation in the globin, it's very well known. And by very simple experiment, we show that when you look at the peptide derived from the hemoglobin A, when you compare to hemoglobin S is able to bind to TLR4, which is a major actor of regulation of inflammation. And so what we do believe is that the release of beta S globin in the peripheral blood will activate this toll receptor with a lot of consequences in innate immunity, macrophages, neutrophils, and also in endothelial cells. And by these mechanisms, we strongly believe that we increase the interaction between red cells and the endothelial cells with the consequences that we know and the chronic inflammation that we do see in this patient. And then now we have to understand this chronic inflammation will lead to a peculiar kind of inflammation because we know this patient, one of the main symptoms is the pain. And pain, you know, we don't understand very well what we are doing. In fact, what we do, patients are suffering of pain. We give morphine to release the pain at the central level, I should say. But morphine has a lot of receptors in the periphery. And we know, and also Slimane have demonstrated that at the periphery, there are some cells that we call mast cells. They release a lot of mediators, and they get activated through the toll receptor, which induce some kind of pain because it stimulates the peripheral nerve with various mediators. And we know that this pain, we have to work on the periphery. And morphine, what do morphine? It accelerates the activation of the innate immune system in the periphery. So we know that by doing morphine, we may release the pain of this patient, but in fact, we worsen and we aggravate the chronic complication of patients with sickle cell disease. So we have to work very well in the future on how to control the pain in this patient with a totally different view as we have before. And in addition to that, we know that opioids is some kind of a dependency of this patient. It's a major problem, a social problem for patients in sickle cell disease. So by working on the mechanism of pain and inflammation, we may reduce a lot of this complication. And here too, I know, and we are sure that looking at the genetic background of the patient and the environment, we may improve also the general status of this patient, to looking at the genetic modifier. So now, if I come back to the treatment, we know like the hallmark and the main treatment is a blood transfusion and hydroxyurea, with the main goal to improve fetal hemoglobin content and reduce the polymerization of the beta globin, but we don't know yet how exactly hydroxyurea is working. Is it working by increasing the fetal hemoglobin only, and what is the mechanism of its increase? Is it working by reducing the polymerization of the beta globin by different changes in the metabolism of the cells? Is it working by reducing the innate immune cells, like neutrophils, for example, and platelet counts, which are very critical inflammatory actors in the overview and physiopathology of sickle cell disease? So we have to work on that, and it's very important. But we know hydroxyurea is a very game changer. Like in Africa, you know, the very nice study that has been published in 2 papers in New England, that we increase overall survival of this patient. And also what is, for me, was very striking, we do see a reduction of falciparum infection and death in this patient. So hydroxyurea may play a role also in the control of the falciparum death in Africa, in the real content, in the real life. So it's very important to try to further understand. And also the last paper that I've shown also that by regulating the level of hydroxyurea to go to the what we call the maximum tolerated dose based on the neutrophil counts, improve also significantly the outcome of this patient, meaning that neutrophils also may play a role. So in the future, we try also to have drugs which may increase the fetal hemoglobin, and you know there is a lot of, I would come back after so gene therapy, but some mediators and try to understand how to modify the regulation of fetal hemoglobin. And now we start to know very well and characterize the promoters and the enhancer of fetal hemoglobin. And one of them, you know, is BCL11A, which repress fetal hemoglobin. So if you do block BCL11A, you may increase the fetal hemoglobin. And there is now a lot of I should say, post-transcriptional modification of BCL11A, depending on the metabolism of the red cells, of the erythroblast, and also a lot of interaction with some kinase and some other transcriptional factors that we know, and we can play a role here by interacting with this complex of transcription. And the last one coming from Novartis, they show that by doing the new treatment using the PROTAC technology, they can reduce and remove, I finished, some transcriptional factor repressing the action of BCL11 and increasing fetal hemoglobin. So here we have a future by doing some pharmacological approach to increase fetal hemoglobin. And then we can work also on the inflammation and, you know, complement play a critical role in this process. Anti-cytokines may play a critical role also to improve acute and chronic complication of sickle cell disease. And here something which is very, very important that we have to work on is to design the best clinical trials to define the best criteria of inclusion. Is not just to say sickle cell, because depending on the complication of the patients, you may improve some symptoms and not others. So you have to define very well your criteria of evaluation if you want to succeed. And it has been very interesting to see drugs like voxelotor or crisantinib, we succeed first and then they fail because they did not design very well clinical trials with not the good endpoint to succeed to register the drug. So now, you know, to cure patients, the only way is a bone marrow transplantation. And bone marrow transplantation, we have a lot of problems. The first one is to find a good donor, to not be too toxic for the patient. And now we have more experience showing that if you look at sibling patients with sibling donors doing sickle cell disease, doing bone marrow transplantation very early, you have 95% success rate and overall survival at 10 years with 95%. But we have to be careful to look at the late complication of this patient because they may experience some chronic GVH and late cancer onset and sterility problems. So we have to come back to define. So what we did is to try to do what we call non-myeloablative conditioning regimen to induce some kind of chimera in the patient, to have not full chimerism of the donor. But in this situation, what we have learned is that some patients may develop myelodysplastic syndrome and acute leukemia because, as I said before, sickle cell disease is a disease of early aging, and the inflammation in the bone marrow leads to the selection of clonal hematopoiesis. And this clonal hematopoiesis has the consequences to develop MDS, and also these abnormal neutrophils, they play a critical role to induce lesions in the periphery like heart, brain, liver, and so on. So we have to control that, and with new conditioning, we do not control that. So we have to be very careful. And then I will finish to gene therapy and gene editing, which is a very scientific breakthrough. But also here we have some kind of problem because we have not defined what will be the best conditioning regimen for this patient, because we have to do a myeloablation, which is not easy task to perform in all countries in the world. And also we have to face a big, strong problem, which is the economical problem, because it costs too much and it's not accessible to the lot of our population. So I will finish here because I'm late. But as I tell you, sickle cell disease from the single gene mutation is a huge just problem, I think, to try to think and to try to improve the lifespan of this patient, the quality of life of this patient. And I strongly believe we have to do good science to try to improve this disease, and also to alert the general community and the politics also to take in account more sickle cell disease, because it's a real health public problem in the whole world. So I think I will stop here, and I'm happy to respond to your question.
Thank you very much, Olivier, for this very complete overview on sickle cell disease. So are there any questions?
And you mentioned the withdrawal of crizanlizumab and voxelotor after, although in theory they were very promising anti-P-selectin and anti-polymerization of hemoglobin S. After we explained the data to the patients, pushed the patients to start on them, after a while we got the information that it's better to stop the patients off these. Although some patients did have positive results, which was surprising. Not sure if it was a placebo effect.
It will be answered in another session.
Excellent.
I will answer this specific
Yes.
question. I just would like to say that Olivier, he has a visionary vision. I don't know if you can say visionary vision. It makes too much vision. But he has created things on red cells, and we, the people with red cell diseases, they are really, they must acknowledge what Olivier has brought. It has been a really important insight for all patients with red cell. And why didn't you conclude with no red cell, no life? Usually he is concluding his talks with no red cell, no life. I like it.
Red cell is life, but it's better, it's positive way. Okay, but what I said also, it's important because I'm a scientist, but also a clinician seeing patients. So this integrative view is very important to define what is the question for the patient, and then you come back to the lab and then translate to the one. It's very important to try to never forget, either if you're a clinician, to look at what's doing in basic science, and basic scientists to look what is doing in clinic. And by doing so, you will do a right clinical trial with the right drug for the right patients.
No, not on new treatment. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to ask about hydroxyurea and what we sometimes see among our patients with aging, that they develop some sort of tolerance to the effect of hydroxyurea. So can you comment on this?
You mean tolerance, you mean? Or
lack of clinical effectiveness as it used to be at the beginning. Okay, thank you.
No, it's okay.
Thanks for the fantastic presentation. I have a quick question about what you said in your presentation. The HBS might induce a chronic inflammation using the toll-like receptor. Has that been studied in depth? Have you tried immunomodulatory drugs? And since the African people tend to have the old school ethnic neutropenia, nowadays Duffy, negative neutropenia, can that also have an effect on this? Or can this be the cause that they have this modification?
It's not, it was well known before that TLR4 play a role in the inflammation in sickle cell disease by different mechanisms of action, but here we show that it's really due to the beta chain. So the idea, if you want to block the TLR4 signaling pathway, which has been done, and knockout mice model also showing that you improve the acute and chronic complication in sickle cell disease, the problem is by blocking the TLR4, the risk is to increase infection in this patient, because we know TLR4 is a critical sensing of bacteria, virus, bacterial infection mainly. So you have to be very careful if you want to block TLR4. The risk is you may reduce chronic inflammation, reduce chronic complication, but you may increase infection and death due to infection in this patient. So the idea is more to block the interaction between HBS specifically to TLR4, to not block the whole TLR4 pathway, but to block the interaction between the two, which is a way that we are working now to try to understand. And for neutropenia, it's very interesting because I was always concerned why we have selected neutropenia in Africa, because there is two hypotheses. Either it's because we protect against a falciparum crisis, because neutrophils and basophils play a role in the encephalopathy in this patient. So if you have neutropenia, you will not die of malaria as the first infection. But in addition, we know that sickle cell disease, if you have neutropenia, you have less complication and you die later and less chronic complication. And we know also that sickle cell may protect also against infection in malaria. So why we have selected neutropenia? It's very interesting to see when you see patients with sickle cell disease, they have usually a more white blood cell count than the patient without sickle cell disease. Probably because of inflammation, but also probably because when you have sickle cell disease, you don't need to have a low neutrophil count because you do less malaria. So I think neutropenia has been selected more for malaria infection than for sickle cell disease. So an hypothesis. You have to follow the shift.